All right, you know that sound is the Unfiltered Band. Another episode of Unfiltered coming your way right here. And right now, officially, this will go down as episode number 245. You could jump on board 2, 4, and 7, 365. Unfiltered Revolution is easy. Apple, Spotify, everywhere you get your podcasts. Go to the artist formerly known as Twitter, or X if you will, at Casey Stern. Give it a follow. Jump up into the bio and follow into the YouTube channel for all of the content on video, the guests, the conversations, the list, the rant, and more. And thank you. Never ranting about the Unfiltered Band, and to all of you who are joining us wherever you might be. Once familiar face back with us. He is a Mets historian and a lifer like me, which means he's in need of desperate therapy. You can get him at Brian Wright 86 on X. He is, of course, because that's his name, Brian Wright. Brian, happy to have you back, sir. How are you?
I'm doing great, Casey. It's great to be back on.
So today we are going to be palate cleansers for Met fans who are worried about their offseason and the season ahead. And we are going to do a top 10 list counting down the top 10 surprises in Mets franchise history. It can be players, it can be teams, it could be stories, pretty much anything open to you, which is why you, wherever you are, should chime in. Get your comments here, whether on X or on YouTube or Apple, Spotify, and everywhere you get your podcasts. Let Brian and I know your thoughts. Of course, we give our thoughts on this team as well. We'll do that in the meantime. We say thank you to Bet Online, your number one source for all your sports betting needs. Latest odds, lines, and matchup reports for baseball when it's back. Basketball, football, boxing, golf, and more. They're your fastest and easiest way to get your wagers. Live betting and favorite casino and card games, they're all available right now from your phone. So do yourself a favor, get over to the website, use your mobile device to sign up today, get in on the action, but remember to use the promo code BELIEVE. That's BLEAV. You'll get a 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit. Bet online where the game starts as we get started here. So let me open-ended and I'll give you my unfiltered take on it. Your assessment of how good, bad, and ugly you feel about where the Mets look right now. We know it's not finished as we do this and tape this on, and this will be out on Monday, January 29th. So maybe on the 30th, because we are talking about all these bad things that have not occurred. They will sign everybody under the sun. They'll trade for Dylan Cease. They will go ahead and sign Justin Turner and J.D. Martinez and everybody else. And they'll lock up Alonso long term. But since none of those things have happened, Brian Wright, your thoughts on this offseason to this point?
Yeah, I'm kind of like in a Zen mode, honestly. I haven't really been on X or Twitter or whatever you call it now. I'm kind of content with everything that they've been doing. I feel like since the trade deadline, this is pre-David Stearns, they've kind of told us what their plan is, long-term plan, and that is rebuild. I don't want to call it rebuild, but it's a restructuring. And the term that I hate hearing, I hate it being used, is punting. I hate, like, they're punting 2024. I've never assumed that that's what they're doing. So I think it's a restructuring, organization based on what they've done the last few years, which has been very aggressive to shorter term, older players, the Scherzers, the Verlanders, and now they've gone to a kind of a vision for long term to have some sustainable success. And I know that Steve Cohen, when he started had this 3 to 5 year championship window. He kind of sort of laid out, which isn't really the case, but the West Coast or the East Coast Dodgers was kind of the one that I took from that. And that, I feel like, is what's being done here. And, fans are not going to like it. I mean, I'm eager. I'm like everybody else. But I haven't sat there and I can't believe they're doing all this. I think they're just getting pieces that could be, used for the future, whether that's trading or or trading away later on, if they're not going to, be in contention. I think they will be in contention. But I've been content with this, and I still think there are moves to make. The bullpen, obviously, they're working on that. They got back Adam Ottavino, and they're still going. And I would like to see them get another bat, another arm. But there's nothing that they have done that's I can't believe they did all this. They went after Yamamoto. They gave him the highest offer at the moment. I can't be unhappy, but I can kind of understand where things have been.
Look, I think there are two things at play here, and I think it's possible, and I'm going to tell you that it sucks and it's terrible and it's all the bad things everybody wants to say, and it's the right thing to do. And I think both of those are mutually in the same parallel line here. And I don't think that's the part that most fans and a lot of pundits in New York that I hear don't understand. Because they sit there and they say, well, the team sucks. They're not doing enough. They promised this. They promised that. Yeah, they were in on Yamamoto. But outside of that, they haven't done anything. What the hell's Cohen doing? And they're not going to be very good, right? Some of that true, some not. But at the same time, here's the reality. I live in Atlanta. The Braves are really, really good. They're really deep, they're really stacked, and they're really not going anywhere. And that's not even mentioning the Phillies or the Marlins or anybody else that you want in this division to mention. You're not even close to as good as this Atlanta team. And that's what you're striving to be because you're striving to win a division and to win championships. And right now, the Braves and the Dodgers are the two best teams in this league, clearly, with LA probably at number one and Atlanta probably not getting enough credit for their chance to be the best team in the National League again, right? The Mets
Mhm.
roster has holes in the bullpen, not nearly deep enough, not nearly good enough. In the rotation, not good enough at the top end, questions on the back end, the middle of the lineup, the depth of the lineup, and you could go on forever. They need to play youth. They need to play the slow game. It's not going to be fun for people to understand that they probably need to maybe outkick their coverage by accident this year, meaning go in as a team that looks like at best they could be a 500 team. And at worst, more likely, if you want my opinion, Brian, I think there are sales the pitch again to everybody else. To your point, they hope Severino pitches well so they could trade him. They hope that
Mhm.
Manaea pitches well so they could trade him. They're looking to move pieces at the deadline, be a 75 win team, because who cares if you win 75 or 85? I certainly don't. A lot of Met fans probably say they don't, but they don't understand. So they do, and they're going to complain about every win. I want to win 95, not 85, right? They're going to then go into the next offseason, I think, and push harder. They'll know more about what they get out of their kids, not Alvarez, who we know sort of already, but the Gilberts and the Acuñas and the Jet Williams and some of these other guys, right, who they have. They don't have pitching in the system. They had guys who were going to celebrate their 50th birthday. They just had to get rid of in Verlander and Scherzer. And this is just the way that it is. So I think it is real that it kind of sucks. They're not that great. They haven't had a great offseason. But what do you expect them to do? They're doing what most New York teams would be too afraid to do. And that's the
Mhm.
right thing. And that's why they brought David Stearns in. I guarantee him. And I haven't asked him, even though, he's the same name as me, except leave off the last S for savings, as they used to say in the old Dial Mattress commercials. But don't you think that David Stearns, when he came in, was asking them, Brian, hey, look, you do understand, like, we can't just go out and spend money ridiculously and I'm going to do this the right way. That's what Andrew Friedman, now look, they spend zillions over the years in LA, but when Friedman got there, it was trying to figure out how to do it, how to take what he learned with the Rays with no money. And by the way, he had Alex Anthopoulos and Josh Burns and all these other guys in his. And that's what David Stearns is going to do. He's going to build people in his front office. He's going to build people at the major league level. They got a first-year manager. To me, the expectations are just too high from fans.
Of course. Oh yeah. And I think I would rather, I'm not saying I'd rather go into a season with no low expectations, but I would rather have that and be pleasantly surprised to an extent than last year where I expected more and obviously we were all disappointed. I fully expect, like, if they are a 500 team, that they would be more sellers than buyers, trying to, like, just go crazy and trying to get a wild card spot. That's probably not that would not fit into what this vision appears to look like or looks like. And the Dodgers, going back to when they went under new management in, like, what was it, 2012? I think what I'm trying to remember when they won their first division. It was not a right away they started winning 100 games or contending for the World Series. I mean, I think maybe it's like 2014, 2015 they started being in contention. So it takes time, and that you're right. I don't think most old Mets teams, or most, if they were in this same position, would have taken this stance. They would have done They would have made silly moves for older players with bad contracts that would have hamstrung them for years. And it's just not the right time to do it. And they went for it for a couple of years, and it didn't work. I mean, 2022 worked out to an extent. 2023 did not work out, and now I remember when they did that sell job, and I was just like, okay, I kind of get this now, and it sucks, but you kind of understood the situation, and they haven't wavered from that. And I mean, David Stearns, I've heard from the time. This is when I stopped going off Twitter, or stopped going on Twitter. Is when they were questioning. Some people were questioning if David Stearns was doing a good job. I'm like, he hasn't been the general manager for an actual game.
Yeah, he just got here, and that's the thing. Yeah. Is Met fans are nuts. They're all crazy. Yeah. They're all nuts. And I love you all, even the ones that I can't stand, because I get it. But they're all nuts. So today's a palate cleanser. We're going to go through, and you're the historian. I'm sitting here, and I'm trying not to be judgmental. There's no right or wrong. I like to bandy with you as We'll banter about kind of maybe who should be higher or lower. We put together the top 10 best surprises, because there have been times, and we'll go through some of them, and players, and we'll go through some of them that we never thought would be ... and they were. So maybe, just maybe, 2024 is going to be added to this list if we do it again next year. But let's start with your honorable mentions before we get to the top 10. Who's in the honorable mention category in your list?
Well, I think Mike Jacobs is the first one, I would say. I'm trying to remember who the other one was. The other one was that Todd Hundley?
I thought you had. Did you? Oh, okay, yeah. You had Todd Hundley in what 96? And look, Todd Hundley in
96, 96 season.
Yeah, the 96 season. And we originally had Jacobs at 10. And I scoffed a little bit, not much, because I had asked you, and it was my revisionist history. I didn't remember how much he did. The Diamondback series, I remember. It was like a 4-game series, I feel like. How many home runs did he hit in that series? I don't even remember it. It's like you remember
3 or 4.
It seems like it was 8, just because it was so many years later, and I just remember him hitting all those home runs. But his rest of that season, before he ended up going to Miami, at the time Florida, which was in the Delgado deal, right? Wasn't that right? When he got traded?
Yes.
So remind me, what was the rest of that season, that run, Jacobs?
So to go back to that Diamondback series, so he actually hit a home run in his first game. Was it like his first at bat? If I'm remembering correctly, he had one at bat, a pinch hit home run in his first at bat in the major leagues against the Nationals at Shea Stadium. And then he was human for a day. He went 0 for 4 in Arizona. And then he hit a home run, and then he hit 2 home runs, drove in 6 RBIs those two games. For the rest of the season, I think he had, I think I told you this, and I'm forgetting now as I go to Baseball Reference, 7 home runs over the final 87 at bats. 7 home runs, 14 RBIs, batted 276. But I mean, no one would have expected that. And I don't really remember Mike Jacobs as being a major prospect. So yeah, that's why I thought about him. And then, he was kind of used, that short period of time was kind of used as a bargaining chip for Carlos Delgado. I mean, there are more pieces involved, but who knows if Mike Jacobs fizzled, would Carlos Delgado happen, or they'd probably use someone else for Carlos Delgado.
I remember, and this is, there are a lot of points in this season, spoiler alert, that may be on here and things relating to the 2015 season as we get into the list at number 10 with the Cespedes trade. I remember being on MLB Network Radio on Sirius XM with Steve Phillips and Jim Bowden doing our live coverage at the time of that trade deadline. And I remember sitting there, and I'm trying to remember the other deals that were David Price was traded towards that last hour of that deadline was crazy in general, and things were coming across the wire. And then here came Cespedes being traded. And you didn't know really what to think about Cespedes, because at the time we had Detroit, we had Boston, we had Oakland, he played for a lot of teams. He's kind of really talented, but does he play defense? Does he pay attention all the time? Does he care? There were all these kind of things that were on there, but the Mets for people who do not remember, went into a Sunday night baseball game in the middle of that season with Soup Campbell and John Mayberry Jr. hitting 3-4, 4-5 in your batting order against the Yankees on a Sunday night game. Legitimately, that actually happened. And there are people right now who are Met fans who are young being like, who the hell are those guys who don't even know who they are, right?
Yeah.
That is how
Yeah.
bad that team was offensively. We are talking about a brutal, disgraceful, disgusting offense. And here came Cespedes. So between the trade and then what he did following, and specifically to Drew Storen in those 6 games against the Nationals that really were the key games that knocked out Matt Williams and that team, deservedly so, I think, for me, bumping Cespedes in that trade in at number 10 on our list.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah, you were on LB Network Radio. I had an office job, and there was a guy who was there temporarily from Long Island, and huge Mets fan. And we remember he had the thickest New York accent. Forget his name, but we talked about them. This was in like the summer. We talked about the Mets. We talked about trades and all that, and coming toward the trade deadline. And if people remember that week, that was the Wilmer Flores crying. That was the Familia gave up the home run in between 2 rain delays. I mean, that was the trade for what Conforto was called up maybe before that. The trade for Juan Uribe and Kelly Johnson. So I mean, just an avalanche of stuff happened that week, and all culminated with not only the Cespedes trade, but then the Wilmer Flores walk-off home run against the Nats. I remember I was in this office and we talked about trades, and Jay Bruce was kind of the one at first that was considered, even up till the July 31st. And obviously next year they'd get him. But I remember saying they should go. I said the guy I really want is Yoenis Cespedes from Detroit, of course. And I remember just going Twitter, just refreshing up till 4 o'clock. Oh my God, did they get him? And yeah, that was fun. Just like not working and being in the office, just looking at Twitter for the entire afternoon. And yeah, I mean, it just that Nationals that night was the Wilmer Flores walk off. Then they had a comeback against the Nats the next night. Then they had the Sunday night game, which I think they had 3 home runs in an inning. And the Mets were off. I mean, they had tied for first place, and they were off in August and September. And I was at those 3 games in Washington in September. And those are the most fun 3 games I've ever been to in my Mets fandom. So what Cespedes did, and also that was a time when Mets fans didn't know if the Mets would be that aggressive. We'll talk about other times in which we didn't think they'd be so aggressive in whether it's in transactions. But that was a time like, oh, the Mets going to do this, or they're just going to stand pat. And they did it, and look what happened. And you can say whatever you want about Cespedes afterwards, but that 3-month period was well worth it.
In 1996, at number 9, a guy who was considered to be a spunky, sort of a spark plug center fielder in Lance Johnson, who would be possibly a leadoff hitter who could maybe help the Mets, ended up having a career year that I don't even think a lot of people really remember. And I looked up just to give you some of the craziness of the surprise of Lance Johnson of 96 and what he became. He had never led the league in stolen bases, but he did average 37 over his career until 1996 when he stole 50. He hit 21 triples, which was his 5th triples title, but he did so hitting 333 on the year and making his first and only trip to the All-Star game. In this season, he struck out only 40 times in the whole year. As a leadoff guy hitting 333, who was not on this team long, because for those who don't remember, and I'm trying to remember what was it the next year, the Brian McRae deal? Was that the following year that he gets traded, right, for BMAC? And I think Mel Rojas was in that trade also.
This is a crazy trade. I mean, not crazy in that it was like convoluted. It's just so many people. I'm gonna read it off to you.
Yeah.
So August 8th, 1997. According to Baseball Reference again, traded to the Cubs for Brian McRae, Mel Rojas, and Turk Wendell.
That's right, Turk Wendell.
And the Mets, and then the Mets sent Mark Clark and Manny Alexander to the Cubs 6 days later to complete the trade. I don't understand. Anyway, I don't know if that was a
Players
players
to
to
be
be named
named.
later.
There must be players
Yeah,
to be named later. Yeah, Mark
yeah,
Larkin,
yeah.
heroic pinch hit.
Oh, you know what? I didn't.
Manny
Yeah,
Alexander, middle infielder extraordinaire as well. Yeah, but
I should have read the
but
first
Lance
sentences.
Johnson.
Yeah,
No, but I remember, John Olerud when he came over, broke a lot of Mets marks at the time with batting average and some of the things that he was doing. But the fact that Lance Johnson was doing this and having the kind of year he had, it always stuck out to me as one of those, like, because the craziest part, maybe part of the surprise, was that it happened and then he was gone. Like, he was
yeah.
there, and you go look at his career, he had a nice career, but it was his career year. He came in and then he was gone, and that was it.
And he never had another year even close to
No.
that. I mean, I mean, right after that, the next year he had in '96. You talk about 21 triples. You talk about only striking out 40 times, 50 stolen bases. He had 227 hits, led the league. He never the next year he had 126. I mean, he played in 111 games, but and then he didn't have more than 100. And he was like with the White Sox, good player, led the American League in hits in the year before, stole, had 12 led the league in triples before, 4 times before that, had, 40 stolen bases, 30 or 40 stolen bases, but he didn't have all of it put together like he did with the Mets that year. And I remember that 96 year, the 96 season, the Mets were not good. They
Oh,
were
terrible.
supposed to be, yeah, but they had Hundley. We talked about Hundley, Lance Johnson. They had Bernard Gilkey, who had a great year in his career year. But they just, as you could tell, they didn't have pitching. But yeah, it was just amazing. Had 3 guys who had career years, and they just did nothing with it. So it just adds to the kind of the craziness of that season of that '96 Mets team.
You mentioned number 8. Um, you mentioned pitching, and at number 8, to me, and this is fairly recent, and I know people are going to scoff at this because I feel like now there's an angst towards Max Scherzer because of how he pitched against the Padres. There's an angst towards Max Scherzer because a lot of Met fans feel like, in some ways he was like, well, if you're not going to be good enough, get me out of here, and then was traded. He wasn't good enough or wasn't healthy enough before then. And what was the oblique situation? Well, it didn't end up the way that it was leading into. Really, look, you go into September in that year one, and Max Scherzer was like the darling of all darlings. And to me, I think the Scherzer signing and the surprise of it belongs on this list. And anybody who tells me, well, how could you be surprised when they offered, what, 130, $140 million, whatever it was, and to a guy that age? It's because nobody, absolutely no one on earth thought Max Scherzer would take the Mets money. It didn't matter that it was Steve Cohen. It didn't matter that it was that much money. He'd take it somewhere else. He'd go back to the Dodgers, where I know he's kind of flat at the end of the year, but he could have gone back there. Or San Diego, who, remember, tried to trade for him in the first place and wanted him and was in that with the Mets, among other teams. This is Max freaking Scherzer, big game pitcher extraordinaire. And the fact that that guy voluntarily, not in a trade, I don't care how much money, was taking Mets money, that is one of the biggest shocks to me in my entirety of my time being a Met fan, and belongs on this list at number 8.
Yeah, it's exactly. It's the signing. It's not exactly what happened afterwards. It's the fact that like he signed with the Mets. I mean, what was the reputation? I guess I don't know if it's gone or not. I don't think any kind of Mets joke will ever go away. But it was like no one wants to come to the Mets. Who wants to come to this team? And yeah, I know it's money. You put in a lot of money, but still, I mean, would not have thought that Max Scherzer would have said, "Okay, I'll come." Even for that, even if it's so much money. Yeah, I mean, I have angst toward him. I did not like the way it ended, or his attitude, or even the way he left. Um, and you're right. Like let's not forget the game to clinch the playoff spot in Milwaukee. I think he pitched it was 6 perfect innings. It might have been. It was terrific. And even with Texas in the World Series, when he had an injury, and obviously he's now out for half the year. In Los Angeles 2021, had the dead arm. it always kind of flatlined. But and in retrospect, like, okay, maybe that was not, I don't know, maybe it was, I don't want to say a waste of money, but let's just, the signing itself and doing what they did, for the fact that the Mets have never done anything to that extent where they went after the biggest fish, and the fish being a pitcher, and putting themselves out there like that. That to me is a landmark. I think we'll look back at that as kind of a landmark deal in Steve Cohen's ownership. Even now, I still think that.
At number 7, the 1984 season. And while 86 was 86, and then it became the other side of a surprise and disappointing, the way it ended with the Dodgers in 88, and the dynasty not being a dynasty and all of that, no matter how much youth was there and how much excitement there was about some of those young players, and I think about Premier League, what Dwight Gooden did in that season in 84, that season kind of just happened so fast. And when I think back to my time as a kid being a Met fan, it was like it almost was happening too fast, and then you thought the ride would never end. And of course, it vaulted up, the climax of it in 1986. But 1984, number 7 on our list, Brian.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of factors that went into the fact that the Mets were how many games, like 22 games better, 22 wins better from 83. Dwight Gooden obviously being at the top of that list. I mean, I don't care how good he did in AAA at the end of the 83 season. No one could have foreseen what happened in 84. So in fact, I guess he could be lumped into this. I mean, he should be. Keith Hernandez, his first full year with the Mets, really taking leadership of the team, being the veteran presence with a bunch of young players. Darryl Strawberry's first full season, and kind of all of that coming together led to really putting them in contention into the end of the season. I think I don't know how many games they finished away from the Cubs, but 90 wins, 90 and 72. Let's face it, most years today, that would get you into the playoffs, and who knows what would happen with an ace pitcher. I'm not saying that the Mets would have done anything, but different time, you never know. So I can't imagine I think if people could have imagined the way they were building prospects that the Mets could have improved from 83, but I don't think anyone could have predicted that.
Yeah, to me, there are certain moments that kind of eclipse anything as a Met fan that you have, and most of them are on the field, like watching Dwight Gooden in 1984, like some of these other ones we're going to talk about that are on the field. To have a moment like at number 6 with the Mike Piazza trade, where I remember where I was. I remember calling every single person I knew, and I don't know how many days it took me to come down from the high I was on, because I couldn't believe it. I remember the only negative thought I had, and I remember this going back to the day of the deal, the only negative thought I had that whole week was Todd Hundley at the time was my favorite Met, and I knew that was the end. And I felt bad for him because even though I didn't think I'd have to see him in left field, I felt bad for him because he had been the best Met during a time where there weren't any good Mets. And he had been such a fan favorite, and he kind of just got discarded. It was fun watching that little end of that season, that series against the Astros, where they were close and they almost made it, and they kind of both playing. It was that really small snippet. But to find out that Mike Piazza, after his 5 legendary days with the Marlins or whatever it was, that he was getting traded to the Mets. Was it Preston Wilson? I'm trying to remember who was even in that deal. Was Preston Wilson in that, right? Wasn't he a big part of that deal? I believe.
I think so. And then,
right?
God, there was some guy named.
Yeah, there was some guy who else was in it, but I think Preston Wilson
Jeff,
was one of the.
There's a guy named Jeff with a G.
But to me, the idea of Mike Piazza being a Met after watching him all those years in LA, and there are seminal moments. I remember when they signed Pedro, right? I remember as a Knick fan when they within 2 days signed Allen Houston, Larry Johnson, and Chris Childs, and I was like, okay, the team's suddenly going to be good again. this was one of those moments where you knew your franchise as a fan, your life was about to change. At number 6, as Mike Piazza became a Met.
Yeah, the trade was for Preston Wilson, Ed Yarnall.
Yeah, Ed
I don't
Yarnell,
even know
yeah,
who that is,
yep,
and Jeff with the G, Jeff Getz, Goetz. There's your trade. I think that
yeah.
worked out.
Preston Wilson went on
Um,
some highs in Florida, and then go to
yeah,
St. Louis and be part of
Colorado.
a team in the playoffs. But I don't really think anybody was feeling bad watching him
Uh,
go. I mean, it's what do you remember about your feeling as a Met fan when he became a Met?
oh, I loved Mike Piazza when he was a Dodger. He was one of my favorite players as a kid. I mean, I was like, 11 years old. And Mike Piazza was one of my favorites. So kind of it was, I would call it, because obviously much older, but Francisco Lindor, I love Francisco Lindor, was in Cleveland. And when you heard that, was out of nowhere, when I was like, Francisco Lindor is coming to the Mets. He's like one of my favorite players, outside of the Mets. So it had similar vibes to that, except for the fact that it was one of those situations where it was like the week or something where he was in Florida, with Florida, and you knew that the Marlins were going to ship him somewhere else, and the Mets, needed a catcher at the time. They just needed a superstar. They were this team that was like, okay, they're 97, 88 wins. They got one, got close. They needed that extra push, and that was Mike Piazza. And I remember, I don't think I was listening to WFAN, being, living in DC, but I remember hearing the fact that this shows like how, way too baseball mature I was. I was probably reading the internet and reading that Steve Phillips said on Mike and the Mad Dog that no, he's not coming to the Mets. Like, we're not making this trade. And I wasn't to say angry, I was disappointed. I was like, why are we not doing this? And what was it? A couple days later, then it happened. I don't remember where I was when I heard it. But yeah, that was I was kind of like you. I just couldn't believe it.
Yeah,
And
I was
yeah.
dumbfounded.
Mhm.
It's one of those moments where you even though you were like you're a big kid, even if you were like 50 at the time, I
Yeah.
imagine. I
Yeah.
mean, I wasn't that
Yeah.
old. At number 5, we got one of 3 seasons on this list. We did 84, 2015, and we talked about it. I want to leave some playoff end of it, alone, because we'll get into it. But the season as a whole was so crazy. And to me, I keep going back to, and I know I said this before, they were so bad. This was a mediocre team with no offense. This was not a good baseball team. They were not as good as the Nationals. If the Nationals, I say this all the time, no offense to Matt Williams, ... If they had made the move to Dusty Baker in July of that year, the Mets don't win this division. Matt Williams threw Drew Storen out there to basically just be a whipping boy for Cespedes. I mean, it was amazing how many times Cespedes was crushing him and how many times he would go to Drew Storen. Jordan Zimmerman could be just blowing the doors off the Mets, and Drew Storen would be in the game for no reason. Those 6 games at the end of that year, which the Mets won them all, were the biggest difference maker. People don't remember the Mets ran away with this division. They were behind like the whole time. At the deadline, they might have been 2.5 out or something like that, but they were still behind. And they ended up winning this division by like a handful of games. It was amazing how just in a span of like 6 to 8 weeks, they completely just outplayed the Nationals and won this East. That to me was the biggest surprise. It wasn't just before the season, Brian, and then the team was good, right? It was for most of the year they weren't good. And then all of a sudden they were freaking great. And that to me was just a shock. That season totally took me by surprise. And I think, and I always say this, a lot of Met fans never really enjoyed this season as much as they could have, because I don't think they realized what was happening while it was happening, because no one thought the team was any good most of the time.
Yeah, and I think just the fact is, as you pointed out, the Nationals were underperformed so much. I remember that was the year they got Max Scherzer, before the season, and let's face it, I think they were World Series favorites. If I can't even look back, but a lot of people thought the Nationals were going to win the World Series in 2015. or they were certainly a heavy contender. And they, as bad as the Mets were, I mean, they were kind of in it in terms of the division up to the trade deadline when we talked about it, and they got Cespedes. And of course, they're only 3 games back because then that series in late July happens. They win all, they sweep the Nats, they're tied. And then we talked about August and September and what they did there, and they won the division by, it wasn't even, I mean, it was a week to go in the season when they clinched it. So yeah, I mean, it was not just the fact that the Mets pulled away. It was just the fact that there was no one kind of giving them any real pushback. And they had young pitchers, which as we all know, they had the young aces, but they just could not hit, and it was just no one to support them. And not only did Cespedes was the spark plug, but other players really came up to, stepped up, as we'll talk about. But yeah, it was just I was more surprised than anything. And the last, August, September was the most enjoyable time I've ever had watching the Mets. I feel like that was the one time I definitely, took it all in and enjoyed it for what it was. And I know that before that, it was as frustrating as anything. But I think the bigger surprise was the fact that they just won they won going away. It wasn't even like a race down to the end.
We're going to get more into 2015 in a bit, so hang tight. At number 4, yes. I want to put into context, because I think there are going to be people who are going to say, well, this can't be bigger than all the things 3, 2, and 1 have something to do with postseasons and runs and parts of runs, and this can't be better than 2015, and it can't be better than that. I'm looking at it as rating surprises. I could make a case that this was a bigger surprise at 4 than anything else on the list. I wouldn't, because I wouldn't put it ahead of the 3, because it didn't mean as much to the Mets necessarily, to the franchise. But if anybody would have told you before the season in 2015, or even during, hey, this is going to happen, you would have considered it highly unlikely if you told them all the events, and they would have probably never believed it. Piazza never believed it. But I think they would have been more concerned with your mental stability if you told them that at number 4, R.A. Dickey would win a Cy Young. I think they would have been more concerned with how many arms you had a medicine cabinet, and if you were drinking too much. Honestly, if you had said to them, hey, look, don't worry, we're going to get the Cy Young this year. Well, who in the staff? R.A. Dickey, the knuckleballer, the failed knuckleballer who hasn't been good anywhere, is going to win a Cy Young. I still don't think we properly understand just how crazy it is that this even happened. Like, I remember watching and going to those games and the sellouts, and just, we're watching a knuckleball. Now, granted, it was faster than some of the other knuckleballs, but no one could understand what was happening when it was happening, Brian. I always say this, it wasn't just 1 year. He did have another good year, at least. Maybe it was 2. But that Cy Young year is the craziest thing, because no knuckleballer can win a Cy. R.A. Dickey, who the hell is R.A. Dickey? It was amazing to watch.
Yeah, I mean, in 2010, he had a good year. He was in 26 starts, had a 2.84 ERA, 138 ERA plus. But yeah, 2020, I mean, he had 2 straight one-hitters. And he could have had a no-hitter. Was it like David Wright made an error? Or David Wright made what could have been an error? Yeah, that's in Tampa Bay.
Yes.
I mean, I propose we need to there needs to be more knuckleballers in the league. That's just my opinion. But I just love watching knuckleball pitchers. But no, I mean, that was so far-fetched to just, I mean, no, and just his personal story and what he overcame to get there makes him one of the, I mean, maybe the most unlikely Cy Young award winner ever. And he was,
it has to be.
He was on the Mets in 2012 when they didn't do anything. And it's just, and I, as ruthless as it sounds, when they were, in the offseason, I'm just like, knowing where the Mets were, I'm just like, they need to trade him because his value will never get any higher than it will be at this point. And then they did it for to the Blue Jays for Syndergaard and Travis d'Arnaud. So I thought that was a good move, as much as that's like a very callous baseballish move, considering what R.A. Dickey meant and what he overcame. It was definitely the right baseball savvy move.
At number three, I had the pleasure of covering a lot of really cool things that I got to witness, and it's weirder when you're there watching it, I think, sometimes, because you just kind of like the atmosphere and everything else. It just, you don't really have the time to assess it. So it's almost like you're living in some alternate reality. But watching Murphtober and the Daniel Murphy run, which we have at number three, and watching that series against the Cubs and being there for those games, that was, look, he hit a home run. You go back to the Dodgers series. Let's start there. He'd always hit home runs off Kershaw, even though he's left-handed. He'd always been good against really good pitching. He'd always had really good at-bats, but this was not a power hitter. Cespedes had carried this team to get to that point in the postseason and then kind of fell apart. We have to remind anybody the circuitous route in which he took to, what is that, Alcides Escobar to open that game one. The triple, if you want to call it that, right? But Daniel Murphy putting this team on his back and becoming Babe Ruth, literally. The guy who had played outfield and then couldn't do that was Murphing the ball all the time at second base. I mean, my gosh, you couldn't find a worse defensive middle infield than him and Wilmer Flores. And how that team was even finding itself in postseasons in general was crazy. Maybe the worst middle infield defense that's ever performed Premier League in a postseason. But Daniel Murphy in that run and what he did in that Cubs series, it's the craziest thing. I mean, in watching it, I just couldn't understand how it was happening. And I don't know that I've ever seen anybody that locked into his zone. He was spitting on pitches and just staring at them, like no twitching, no flinching, nothing, just eyeing curveballs that were good pitches that bounced into the dirt. Like there was no way he was going to swing at anything that was not in his zone at that time. That's as locked in as I've ever seen a hitter that's not a Barry Bonds level kind of a hitter who's locked in all the time. Murphtober at number three.
Yeah, and there may be some pushback because the next two seasons he hit 25 home runs with the Nats, of course, hit 25 and 23 home runs. Even if he hit 25 home runs in 2015 and then went on that run, I would still go, this is crazy. Like, what is going on? To hit 6 home runs in consecutive games is unprecedented. And he hit 14 during the regular season, which makes it even more unprecedented, or just more out of the blue. It was probably a sign sort of things to come. But again, you can't equate the two. You can't equate 162 games hitting 25 homers to hitting 6 in 6. So, I mean, I was just dumbfounded watching it. I think everyone was. And it seems like, you always have these postseasons where one player just is locked in, and he was as locked in as anyone ever. I mean, I think I wrote in one of my books he was Babe Ruth and Reggie Jackson rolled into one, and it's Daniel Murphy. And whatever you want to say about his defense and his base running. And I remember he made that great base running play after a walk in Game 5 against the Dodgers. And in retrospect, I'd be like, okay, so maybe he's just like, he's transformed into something else where he can now run the bases well. He's hitting home runs. For that period up until like the World Series started, and what that error he made in, what was it, Game 4? There was that stretch. I thought he was invincible and could have carried it a little bit further, but we'll take that period where he carried it to the World Series.
At number 3, Murphtober. At number 2, just one name, and it's got a lowercase d, DeGrom. I know that Met fans are, I don't know why they can be salty necessarily. I mean, look, things DeGrom said, or they didn't think he wanted to be in New York enough, or all that. They could think about all that. I mentioned, there's certain guys who brought an event nature to Shea and then to Citi Field. Mike Piazza, right? Pedro Martinez did that. Jacob DeGrom brought that back to the Mets. It was, the irony and the surprise of DeGrom to me comes in so many facets. You can go from former shortstop at Stetson to the fact that, to me, if you go to Harvey, DeGrom, and Syndergaard, when that was a thing, everybody had DeGrom third. Everybody. Harvey was everybody's favorite. Thor was everybody's like fan favorite in terms of like the phenomenon that he wears with the helmets and all that stuff and the 100-mile-an-hour fastball. And then there was this DeGrom guy with the long hair who's kind of good. And then here he is in every big spot. Here he is in every big game. Here he is putting together seasons like the Mets had not seen since Tom Seaver. And to me, the most dominant pitcher I've ever seen is Pedro Martinez. I got to watch him. I was in college in Boston at the time. And that 99-2000 season, the best back-to-back seasons, I think, in the history of this sport because of that era and the division he's pitching in. No offense to Sandy Koufax or Bob Gibson, who are the other two of those dominants, or Greg Maddux, who was dominant in general. But you could make a case that Jacob deGrom had time periods of 6 months, a year, 2.5 years in some stretches, depending upon what numbers you want to pick, that he was just as dominant as any of the guys I just mentioned. With a repertoire none of those guys had. Because, Pedro was dynamic with that changeup, and it was as good a changeup as I've ever seen. And yeah, that was really good. But DeGrom dialing up 101 and then dotting sliders at 93. I've never seen anybody pitch that way. We saw Matt Harvey pitch that way for about 34 seconds, and people thought it was the greatest thing they'd ever seen. DeGrom pitched that way for like 5 seasons. If he doesn't get injured, and it happens consistently, it's one of the greatest runs in the history of baseball on a mound. And Jacob deGrom, to me, belongs with his lowercase at number 2.
I mean, if we talk about if I told you when it was first, before it happened, like this will happen, and you would have thought, when we talked about for R.A. Dickey, he's going to win Cy Young, you're like, okay, how much have you been drinking? How much, what are you on? I think if you had said Jacob, we talked about all the pitchers, you could even put Steven Matz in there. I mean, the hometown favorite. I mean, people would have put him probably also in that ahead of Jacob deGrom. If you would have said Jacob deGrom when he was called up in May 2014 as like bullpen help for, I think, Dylan G, and then Dylan G got injured and he was like emergency starter in a Subway Series game against the Yankees at Citi Field. At that time, I think like Rafael Montero was the bigger prospect. It was like, oh, he's going to be the start. He's going to be the kind of the bigger, more standout pitcher than this Jacob deGrom guy, whoever he is. And had a great outing against the Yankees. Didn't get any run support, so that's that set the tone. But yeah, if you had said like Jacob deGrom will then will go do exactly what he did, win 2 straight Cy Youngs, become the most, basically put about the best stretch of pitching that we've seen since, I think, Pedro Martinez, I would agree with you. I never would have imagined that. I mean, no one would have imagined that. And he was that, was that like Ferrari who you would see go out on the racetrack and go, oh my God, I've never seen this, with his, the fastball and the accuracy with the fastball and the slider. I mean, it's, whatever you might feel, however you feel after he left, I think you have to appreciate what he did do when he was here. I mean, I never would have considered anyone being in the same category as Tom Seaver. And I'm not saying Jacob deGrom is the greatest pitcher in Mets history, but now you could actually make some kind of case of why Jacob deGrom might be better than Tom Seaver, even though it's not true. The fact that you could have a conversation, I think, speaks to how great a surprise that was, knowing where Jacob deGrom started.
Number 1 on a list like this is easy when you do it with this team, because I always think about, to me, the greatest upset in the history of sports, I don't even think it's double, or greatest surprise, you want to say, in the history of sports, are the 1980 U.S. men's hockey team in Lake Placid. And fittingly, Al Michaels at the end, which everybody famously remembers, do you believe in miracles? Yes. Season in your team is defined by a moniker of being a miracle. That tells you just how big a surprise it is, and I think says it for it. 1969 was a year where the Mets had come in their previous 7 seasons, never finished higher than 9th place in that 10-team National League before, of course, that first divisional play season in 1969. That's how bad they were. The franchise had no success. There were no dreams. There were no visions of grandeur. There was nothing. There was no hope. And then the miracle happened that is our number one on our list, 1969.
Yeah, I think looking back, and if when you look back and say, oh, this is a team that had Tom Seaver, Jerry Kuzman, they had a young Nolan Ryan, maybe not developed the way he would be in Anaheim or Houston or whatever, or Texas. But if, you could look back and go, oh, they had Gil Hodges as manager. That I don't care if you have those three great pitchers, you have a great manager, you have it's not even conceivable that it even I still think it's not conceivable looking back to go like, how did they win 100 games? How did they beat the Orioles who had 109 wins and win the World Series, pretty in 5 games with the lineup they had. The way Gil Hodges maneuvered that lineup and played it to its highest capabilities with his way of adjusting. But yeah, I mean, it's you could have expected probably if you were before the 1969 season. I think there were 101 odd. They had 101 odds to win the World Series. I guess that's plus 10,000 if you're if you're looking on FanDuel or Bet Online, I should say. I shouldn't say FanDuel. But you would have just never had imagined that. And even considering what these pitchers would turn into, it's not, no team is ever, carried by only a couple people. You need other things to happen. You need, let's face it, like, the Cubs to collapse. You need the Mets to get as hot as they ever had gotten in their history. A team that had never been in first place until September 10th of that year. I mean, they were even above 500. There was like a certain point in the year which they had never been above 500, and they exceeded that in it was like June or something like that. And then like I said, the Cubs collapse, they get hot, and then everything that went down in the, sweeping the Braves and then the Orioles series with, bounces going your way, making great catches, Tommy Agee, Ron Swoboda, the shoe polish, the comeback in Game 5. I think not only the results, but the way it happened. That's what sets us over the top. It's not just the fact that they won the World Series. Let's face it, a true, just kind of, incredible happening, but kind of the events that
especially if
led to
it's
that
a
end result.
surprise in itself.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
surprise
So
in
it's just
itself
like
that
all
any
that.
Met team can win a World Series. Yeah, it's a special season and a special run. And while I don't think anything in 2024 is going to end up on this list, you never know. If R.A. Dickey could win a Cy Young, let me just say, literally anything can happen. And hopefully it will. Part of the reason could be the young core. Brian's going to rejoin me, and we're going to get into that here in a couple of weeks and talk about kind of how it matches up to some of the young cores of the past for the Mets. But young and old, let us know your comments at Brian Wright 86 Stern and give us your thoughts. What would have made your list and where you fare. Brian, we'll do this again soon, man. This was fun.
Oh, this is a lot of fun, Casey. I'm glad we're talking about good things, palate cleansers. Yeah, I'm happy to do it again.
We need it. We need it for sure. Our top 10 list in the books. You could join us as always on Unfiltered, Apple, Spotify, everywhere you get your podcasts. As always, we are presented by our good friends at Bet Online.